In this video, I'm going to take you through the chart that compares Alexander Hamilton to Thomas Jefferson. You'll be taking an open notes quiz using this chart. It's actually going to be an open-ended question that you will answer using evidence from the chart to support your answer. I'll just erase these marks as I go. You want to compare your answers to mine. Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson is giving advice about foreign policy, and as Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton is giving advice about the economy. Let's look at their personal backgrounds. Alexander Hamilton has a very interesting background. He was born and raised in the British West Indies, which are the islands in the Caribbean. He was basically an orphan by the age of 13. Even though his dad was alive, he really had nothing to do with Alexander Hamilton. His parents were not married when they had him, and his dad left when Alexander was a very young age, and his mom was raising him. She died, and then some other family members died that were taking care of him. So basically, by the time he's your age, he's on his own. He was running a shipping company in his teens. This is the kind of kid who is living in the worst poverty you can imagine, and he has to do whatever he can to survive. And instead of just wallowing in that squalor, he pulls himself up by his bootstraps, and he's determined to make something of himself. He impresses a lot of people at the business where he works, and they actually raised some money to send him to America to go to college because they just knew there was something special about him. He ends up, of course, we know his story about the Revolutionary War, how he ends up being George Washington's right-hand man in the war. And during the war, he ends up marrying into a very wealthy New York family, the Schuyler family. He does become a lawyer, which is what he's doing right after the war ends. And he's a delegate to 4 of the Continental Congresses. So he works his way up, and everything he has is because of his hard work, really. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson is born and raised in Virginia. He inherited a 5,000-acre plantation at age 14. Imagine being 14 years old and inheriting 5,000 acres that you have to take care of. He attended college and also practiced law. He goes into politics. He served in the House of Burgesses, which is like the Congress on the Virginia level. He's a delegate to 2 Continental Congresses. Obviously, we know he wrote the Declaration of Independence at one of those meetings. He becomes the governor of Virginia. He was actually the governor of Virginia during the Revolutionary War. He's an architect. He's an inventor. He ends up becoming the ambassador to France. So he is a very well-established, well-educated gentleman from Virginia. On the other hand, you have Alexander Hamilton, who's more of a scrappy, grew up on the streets kind of a guy. Okay, so they join the cabinet to serve under George Washington, and they have different ideas about how the country should be run. Alexander Hamilton is the Treasury Secretary, so economic policy is his thing. He thinks that foreign debt should be paid immediately. All of the debt that we had from the war was looming over us, and he wanted to pay it immediately. And then the bonds that had been sold to Americans, which is basically a loan, he wanted to gradually repay those back, the full value. What had happened is because the economy was so bad, those government bonds weren't worth very much money. And so a lot of Americans just sold them to get rid of them before they lost even more money. If they gradually repay the full value of those bonds to people that bought them early on in the war, it will benefit speculators, who are people that buy low to sell high. Basically like you're gambling, kind of like the stock market. He feels like this is the fair way to do this. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson is afraid that this is taking advantage of poor and ignorant investors that sold their bonds early for a loss. So Thomas Jefferson is looking out for the poor people, whereas Alexander Hamilton figures, well, if you were patient and you stuck with us for the long haul, you deserve to be rewarded. So 2 very different outlooks there when it comes to paying off the debt. And then we also have, I need to scroll, but it won't let me. Sorry. There we go. I'm sorry. States debts. What do we do about states debts? By the way, you can pause this video anytime you need to, obviously, to adjust your answers on your chart. I suppose that goes without saying, but I should say it. Okay. States debts. Each individual state helped pay for the Revolutionary War, and some of the states are in a lot of debt from that, especially the northern states. Alexander Hamilton wanted the federal government to pay off the state's debts because he argued it would free up money for the states to invest in business and trade, which in the end would benefit the national economy anyway. So he thought that was the best way to go. Free up the states, untie their hands, take care of their debt for them, and then we'll have a happy ending. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, says that's not fair. Southern states had little to no debt. They had already paid their debts, and so this plan only benefited northern states. Well, of course, remember Hamilton's from New York, a northern state, and Jefferson's from Virginia, a southern state. So you see this geographic difference between the two men and their philosophies. He also argues Congress doesn't have the power to pay states' debts, so they shouldn't be doing it anyway, even if he wanted to. So there's an argument there. Speaking of government's power, Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong central government, a strong federal government. Remember, he did write most of the Federalist Papers that argued for a strong federal government, so that's not a big surprise. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson wants a weak central government. He would rather see the state governments be strong at the local level. And this is where you start to see the formation of political parties. Now, that's page 1. If you want to pause here and come back to this video tomorrow, you could do that after you've already finished the second page. But I'm going to keep going, so if you want to keep going, you can too. All right, economic preferences. Alexander Hamilton says that we should be promoting and supporting and rewarding manufacturing and business. He wanted the federal government to reward innovative companies. He also favored protective tariffs that would raise the prices of foreign goods. That's what a tariff is. It's an import tax. It's a tax on things coming from other countries. The idea is if you make foreign goods more expensive, it will encourage people to buy American-made products, which helps American companies and creates American jobs. This is actually what President Trump was doing when he first became president. So this is not something, just from the 18th century. This is an argument that people still make today. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, says we should be supporting our farmers. This nation was founded as an agricultural nation, and it's the farmers and the poor people that get hurt by tariffs because prices could possibly go up. Things are more expensive, obviously, coming from overseas, that's for sure, because you're putting a tariff on it, and he feels like that's a bad idea. All right, how do they feel about just the average everyday American? Hamilton thinks that the average citizen really has no interest in public affairs and they don't really pay attention and they don't care what's going on in the government and such. And you can't really rely on people's patriotism alone. And he honestly thinks that the people are usually wrong anyway. We need people like him who are experienced and educated to run the government. So popular sovereignty is not really high on his list of priorities. Whereas Thomas Jefferson believes each citizen could work to better society, that we are all capable as long as we are educated. We must be educated so we can effectively participate in democracy. He feels if we're all educated, we will be able to make good decisions, and therefore the will of the majority really is the way to go in a democracy like this. Banking. This is a very specific argument that they had. Hamilton is obviously the Treasury Secretary, so this is definitely his wheelhouse. He wanted to establish a national bank that would make loans and issue money. a bank that is run by the government. He thought that would stabilize the economy and give a centralized location for our money. But Jefferson thinks that's a terrible idea, and he also argues that Congress does not even have the power to create a national bank. So here he goes again talking about limiting Congress's power or the federal government's power. This seems to be a theme with him. And it continues in our next topic here, interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution can be interpreted different ways. This is why we have the Supreme Court. That's their job, is to interpret the Constitution for us. Some people think that we should be able to loosely interpret the Constitution. In other words, kind of read between the lines and take any reasonable actions that are not listed in the Constitution. So in other words, Hamilton believes just because it's not in there doesn't mean we can't do it. But Jefferson says, no, that's exactly what it means. If it's not in there, you can't do it. He's a strict interpreter of the Constitution. He believes the federal government should only do what the Constitution specifically says it can do. And if it's not mentioned, that means the government cannot do it. Again, he likes to limit the power of the federal government. And that brings us finally to the formation of political parties. You've seen this coming. We've seen it coming for a while. You had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that were formed sort of during the Constitutional Convention. And by the time George Washington leaves office, you're going to have two political parties that rival each other. The Federalists, which of course Hamilton is a part of, and the Democratic Republicans. That's what they called themselves. Oh, sorry about that. That just jumped. Okay. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. So these are your first American political parties. They do not line up perfectly with the Democrats and Republicans we have today. You can't say that Hamilton was one or the other. You can't really say Thomas Jefferson was one or the other. These are going to morph and mutate into the political parties we have today, and that's something that you're going to be learning throughout the school year. So stay tuned for that. Let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, you definitely want to have a good chart that you can use during your open notes quiz.